3 words ended 18 months of silence, and the man who said them wasn't angry. He was completely, terrifyingly calm. Mark Carney walked into a joint press event in Ottawa, a routine diplomatic appearance, the kind where nothing is supposed to happen. And by the time he left, the Dow had dropped 345 points. 3 international banks had issued risk warnings, and 2 of the world's largest multinationals had frozen their expansion plans. But none of that is the story. The story is what happened in the 4 seconds of absolute silence after Carney finished speaking. If you want daily updates on how this situation keeps developing, hit subscribe right now, because this one is far from over. To understand why those 3 words hit the way they did, you need to understand the 60 seconds that came before them. Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his posture. He placed a single sheet of paper on the podium, a prop, never once glanced at, and began with the most ordinary diplomatic language imaginable. He thanked the host. He acknowledged ongoing talks. He reaffirmed Canada's commitment to a mutually beneficial partnership. Standard, steady, forgettable. The kind of language that makes journalists stop paying attention. That was the point. Because what came next was being loaded while the room was still relaxed. He started with a number, 18 months. He called it what international law calls it. Not a trade dispute, not a tariff conflict, but ongoing economic pressure from Canada's closest ally. A precise legal term with precise legal consequences. Then he listed one by one every diplomatic message sent, every negotiation framework proposed, every time Canadian representatives flew to Washington and sat across the table in good faith. And then he stated plainly what all of it had produced. Nothing. No movement. No meaningful reply. The room was still taking notes. Nobody yet understood that they were watching a closing argument, not an opening statement. Stay with us on this. What happens next changes everything about how this confrontation gets read. Then he paused. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough for the cameras to tighten. Long enough for the journalists in the front row to stop writing and start watching. And in a voice that never once climbed above a conversational register, he said this. Canada had offered every courtesy, proposed every structure, absorbed economic penalties designed not to create fair trade, but to extract surrender. And surrender, he said, was the one thing Canada would never provide. Not to any nation, not under any pressure, not under any condition. Then, with the flags of both countries in frame and the President of the United States standing 6 feet away, he added one final line. With all the respect owed to the office of the presidency, but none of the submission being demanded of Canada, go to hell. The room did not react, not immediately. 4 seconds of silence so complete that you could hear the air conditioning. Not the silence of shock, the silence of comprehension. Every person in that room understood simultaneously that what they had just witnessed could not be walked back, reframed, or minimized. A sitting head of government had just told the President of the United States exactly where to go, on camera, in front of 14 nations, with the footage already uploading to every major wire service in the world. Trump's response came fast, too fast. His jaw tightened, his posture shifted. 2 aides stepped forward. One reached for her phone before he had spoken a single word. When he did speak, the voice was strained, short sentences, clipped delivery. He called Carney's statement disgraceful, an insult to the American people. He said there would be consequences. And then, in what his communications team would spend the next 48 hours trying to bury, he called Carney a failed banker playing prime minister. That line was personal. It was unplanned. And in diplomatic terms, it was catastrophic. Because the record doesn't preserve tone. It preserves words. And the words showed a president answering a principled refusal of economic coercion with a personal attack on a foreign head of government. In international relations, that distinction matters enormously. The leader who escalates from policy to personal is the leader who loses the room. He lost the room. 3 veteran White House correspondents told their editors afterward they had never seen the president lose composure at a joint availability. One said simply, he looked like someone who'd been hit and had no plan for what came next. Within 6 hours, the White House Communications Office had drafted and discarded 4 separate response strategies. Within 12 hours, 2 senior advisors had given contradictory statements to different outlets. One calling Carney's remarks a desperate provocation, the other dismissing them as meaningless, without either knowing what the other had said. The contradiction was published before anyone could correct it. Within 24 hours, the president responded publicly. The response made everything worse. Markets moved before the political analysts finished their first takes. The Dow fell 345 points in the opening 90 minutes of trading after Trump's reply. Not because of a new tariff, not because of a policy announcement, because the category of the conflict had changed. Markets understand instinctively what politicians sometimes don't. There is a hard boundary between calculated strategy and personal anger. When that boundary gets crossed, the risk calculation for everything attached to both names changes immediately. Three of the largest international banks with cross-border exposure to both economies issued internal risk alerts within 48 hours. Two multinationals with major operations in both countries announced pauses on expansion until diplomatic conditions stabilized. A European investment fund began quietly reducing positions in properties connected to the Trump brand. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a steady, rational repricing of exposure to a brand whose headline risk profile had just changed overnight. The licensing reviews started next. Two international partners, companies paying to carry the Trump name on their properties, opened what the industry calls brand alignment assessments. In plain language, a formal process to determine whether the name they are paying for still delivers the exclusivity and aspirational appeal that justifies the fee. Starting a review is not ending a contract, but it is the step that comes directly before that conversation. And the insurance sector moved in parallel, underwriters quietly adjusting premiums, tightening terms, and recalculating headline risk exposure across the entire property portfolio. None of it dramatic, all of it expensive. The diplomatic signal was equally precise. The European Union's foreign policy chief issued a statement expressing concern about the tone of exchanges between allied nations, and notably did not criticize Carney. In diplomatic language, what you choose not to say is often more important than what you do. The United Kingdom issued a carefully worded statement about the value of diplomatic conduct that somehow avoided implying Carney had violated it. Germany's chancellor reaffirmed the principle that economic tools should not be used as instruments of political pressure between allies, using the exact framing Carney had used. That choice of language was not accidental. Australia's Prime Minister said he wouldn't comment on another leader's remarks, but acknowledged the concerns Canada had raised were widely shared. Japan said nothing at all. In this context, silence is alignment. Three Republican senators, members of the president's own party, issued statements that focused not on Carney's words, but on Trump's. Each confirmed support for the administration's trade objectives. Each expressed concern about what one senator called the tone and temperament of the exchange. That phrase, tone and temperament, is a very specific marker in American political language. It is not criticism. It is the step that comes before criticism. It is the language that goes on the record early, so that if things deteriorate further, there is a documented moment when the concern was first raised. Those senators were not breaking from the president. They were building an exit ramp. What Carney did has a name in international relations theory. It's called a credibility signal, a costly, public, irreversible action that communicates commitment so clearly it resets the strategic calculations of every other actor watching. Telling the President of the United States to go to hell is costly. It forecloses certain diplomatic paths. It makes personal reconciliation between the two leaders functionally impossible. Carney accepted every one of those costs openly, in public, in real time. That acceptance is the signal. It tells every government watching that Canada's position is not a negotiating posture. It is a fixed point. Before that press conference, the working assumption in most international capitals was that some form of agreement between the U.S. and Canada was inevitable, because the economics of proximity made it rational. After the press conference, that assumption collapsed. Not because the economics changed, because the personal dynamic between the two leaders changed in a way that cannot be undone. Markets and governments both understand this. Two leaders operating from personal hostility don't make rational economic decisions. They make emotional ones. The futures contracts tied to cross-border trade flows adjusted within hours. Contingency supply chain plans that companies had kept dormant for months were quietly activated, not because a new policy had been announced, but because the judgment had shifted about whether those plans would actually be needed. Here is where this stands. Carney told the President of the United States to go to hell on a live global stage. The words were not spontaneous. They were the final line of a 60-second legal and diplomatic argument constructed to make them land not as an insult, but as a conclusion. Trump replied with visible anger that confirmed the strike had connected. The White House cycled through 4 response strategies in 96 hours. 3 allied governments aligned with Canada's framing without naming it. 3 Republican senators raised concerns about presidential temperament. The Dow dropped 345 points. International banks issued warnings. Multinationals paused expansion. Licensing partners opened reviews. Insurance premiums shifted. Trump has built an entire political identity around the image of a man who controls every room, dominates every exchange, and never lets the pressure show. Carney reached that image in 2 seconds with 3 words on a stage where every camera in the world was recording. And the footage doesn't negotiate. It doesn't soften. It doesn't expire. It plays again and again. And every time it plays, the gap between the projected image and the visible reality gets a little wider. The cost a little harder to ignore. But the consequences stretch beyond one brand and one bilateral relationship. What the world watched in Ottawa was a middle power, a country with every economic reason to stay quiet. Choose a different calculation. Not recklessness, calculation. The logic Carney was countering is the logic of sustained pressure, that patience is weakness, that silence reads as consent, that if you keep absorbing the hits long enough, eventually the target bends. He did not bend. And the signal that sent to every other government currently absorbing economic pressure from Washington was immediate and unmistakable. This was not a Canadian story. It was a signal transmitted to every capital city and every boardroom where leaders have been watching and waiting to see whether resistance was even possible. The answer, it turns out, is yes. The cost is real, and the path forward remains uncertain. But for one moment in Ottawa, 18 months of grinding pressure met a wall of absolute refusal, and the wall didn't move. 3 words: measured delivery, catastrophic impact. The world heard it, the market priced it, and the full cost of that moment is still being calculated daily. When stories move this fast, missing a single day means missing the shift. If you want to stay ahead of how this develops, the market moves, the diplomatic signals, the next response from Washington, subscribe now. Every update lands daily, and this situation is nowhere near its final chapter. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened in Ottawa and why it matters, share it with someone who's still trying to piece it together. And if there's a dimension of this story you want us to go deeper on, drop it in the comments. We read every one.